What if the most dangerous military conflict of the 21st century wasn't started by miscalculation, but by manipulation? What if the United States, the most powerful military force in human history, was deliberately walked into a war that its own general said couldn't be won, by an ally that needed American firepower to accomplish goals America itself never signed up for? And what if the consequences of that war, not just for soldiers or governments, but for your heating bill, your job, the price of everything you buy, are only just beginning to be felt? This isn't a hypothetical. According to some of the most serious strategic thinkers in the country, this is exactly where we are right now. And the scariest part? The exit door is narrowing by the day. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand not just what's happening, but why it was almost inevitable, and what it means for the world you're living in. For 3 decades, the Pentagon resisted going to war with Iran. That's not a small thing. We're talking about administrations from both parties, Bush, Obama, Biden, all of whom faced sustained pressure from Israel to take military action against Tehran, and all of whom said no. The reasons were always the same: the military knew the math didn't work. Iran is not Iraq. It's a large, mountainous country with a population of nearly 90 million people, a sophisticated military doctrine, and a missile arsenal that has been quietly growing for years. Every serious war game the Pentagon ran ended badly for the United States. So how did we end up here? The answer seems to come down to one critical vulnerability: Donald Trump. Where his predecessors saw a trap, Trump saw an opportunity, an easy win, a show of strength, a chance to do what nobody else had the courage to do. When Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu reportedly told him that the Iranian regime was fragile, that a decapitation strike against its leadership would cause it to collapse like a house of cards, Trump believed it. And this is where the strategic analysis gets genuinely chilling, because even the general Trump himself appointed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs warned him, before the shooting started, that there was no viable military option. That general was right. And he knew he was right. And the war happened anyway. Here's what most Western media coverage gets wrong about this conflict. It frames it as a question of firepower: bombs dropped, targets destroyed, kill counts. But Iran is not fighting a firepower war. Iran is fighting a strategic war, and on those terms, they are winning. Rather than meeting American naval power head-on, which would be suicidal, Iran made a different calculation. They looked at the region and saw something the United States seems to have forgotten: the Gulf states are extraordinarily fragile. These are wealthy, modernized countries that exist in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Their water comes from desalination plants. Their economies run on oil infrastructure that is, by its nature, exposed and concentrated. And they sit within easy range of Iran's enormous arsenal of short-range ballistic missiles and drones. Iran's strategy has been methodical. Degrade radar installations so the US and Israel lose the ability to track incoming threats. Strike American bases and logistics networks to raise the cost of the American military presence. Apply sustained pressure to Gulf energy infrastructure to trigger an oil shock that ripples through the entire global economy. And crucially, hold the really devastating options in reserve as leverage. Iran still has hypersonic missiles largely untested in this conflict. It has the capability to comprehensively target Israeli desalination plants. It hasn't used those cards yet, because it doesn't need to. The threat of using them is more valuable than using them. That is sophisticated strategic thinking, and it's working. When military strategists talk about escalation dominance, they mean the ability to raise the stakes of a conflict in ways your opponent can't match. The Trump administration has repeatedly claimed the United States holds this advantage over Iran. The evidence suggests the opposite. Consider what escalation actually looks like in this war. The US and Israel increase bombing. Iran responds by hitting more Gulf infrastructure and threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz more completely. The US and Israel target civilian-adjacent areas. Iran retaliates against desalination plants, multiplying the humanitarian and economic consequences. The US and Israel try to destroy Iran's petroleum sector. Iran responds by doing the same to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, potentially collapsing the energy economies of two of the wealthiest nations on Earth. At every rung of that ladder, Iran has a credible and painful response. And here's the historical reality that no amount of American military confidence can erase: air campaigns alone do not produce regime change. This has been tested, repeatedly, at enormous human cost. The firebombing of Japan killed more people in a single night than either nuclear weapon dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and Japan did not surrender. Germany was bombed into rubble across 6 years of war, and its government fought until Soviet troops were literally in Berlin. North Korea was bombed so comprehensively that there was almost nothing left to bomb, and the regime survived. The historical record is unambiguous: you cannot bomb a determined government into collapse without putting soldiers on the ground. And no one, not even the most hawkish voices in Washington, is seriously proposing a ground invasion of Iran. Let's talk about what this means for the rest of the world, because this is where the conflict stops being an abstract geopolitical drama and starts affecting the daily life of people who have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply transits that strait. When that flow is disrupted, even partially, it doesn't just mean higher gas prices. It means higher prices for everything that is manufactured, transported, heated, or cooled. It means inflation in countries that are already struggling. For Europe, which has already lost access to cheap Russian energy and is still rebuilding its industrial base, a prolonged Gulf energy disruption could be catastrophic. Japan and South Korea are even more exposed. Their industrial economies are deeply dependent on Middle Eastern oil in a way that China, which has been diversifying its energy sources aggressively, is not. The Trump administration understands this. There is evidence they are looking for an off-ramp, a way to declare some version of victory and step back from the edge. The problem is that off-ramps require two parties, and Iran has no incentive to offer one for free. Iran will want sanctions relief. It will likely want reparations. It will want some form of security guarantee that the United States and Israel will not simply restart this conflict in another year. These are not unreasonable demands from Iran's perspective, but meeting them will look, domestically, like exactly the kind of humiliation that American political culture finds almost impossible to absorb. There is a final dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed with appropriate seriousness, and it concerns Israel's long-term future. Israel is now fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously: Iran, Hezbollah, and the ongoing situation in Gaza. Each of those conflicts, individually, would be a serious military challenge. Together, they represent a sustained, multidirectional pressure that has no obvious end point. And here is the deeper problem. Israel's strategic doctrine has always rested on a combination of deterrence and decisive military superiority. The goal was always to end wars quickly and conclusively, to impose such costs on adversaries that they would not choose to fight again. That doctrine is being tested to destruction. Iran is not deterred. Hezbollah is not deterred. And as this conflict drags on, the prospect of Iran eventually developing a nuclear weapon, which now seems more likely, not less, given the new Iranian leadership's disposition, transforms the entire security calculus. For ordinary Israeli citizens, the question is becoming increasingly personal. If you are living under the threat of missile strikes, running to shelters regularly, watching the regional security architecture that was supposed to protect you fail in real time, and facing the possibility of a nuclear-armed adversary within a decade, at what point does the calculation about where to build your life begin to change? Societies can sustain extraordinary hardship, but they cannot sustain it indefinitely without consequences. There is a final dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed with appropriate seriousness, and it concerns Israel's long-term future. Israel is now fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously: Iran, Hezbollah, and the ongoing situation in Gaza. Each of those conflicts, individually, would be a serious military challenge. Together, they represent a sustained, multidirectional pressure that has no obvious end point. And here is the deeper problem. Israel's strategic doctrine has always rested on a combination of deterrence and decisive military superiority. The goal was always to end wars quickly and conclusively, to impose such costs on adversaries that they would not choose to fight again. That doctrine is being tested to destruction. Iran is not deterred. Hezbollah is not deterred. And as this conflict drags on, the prospect of Iran eventually developing a nuclear weapon, which now seems more likely, not less, given the new Iranian leadership's disposition, transforms the entire security calculus. For ordinary Israeli citizens, the question is becoming increasingly personal. If you are living under the threat of missile strikes, running to shelters regularly, watching the regional security architecture that was supposed to protect you fail in real time, and facing the possibility of a nuclear-armed adversary within a decade, at what point does the calculation about where to build your life begin to change? Societies can sustain extraordinary hardship, but they cannot sustain it indefinitely without consequences.